NAMM A2 is out. Is the hype real? Let's find out. Luckily for us, the NAMM people released some data, which I'm a big fan of. So we're going to look at the general improvements, the tests conducted, the results, what was not covered, and some of the takeaways. The general improvements to NAMM are that A2 full is about 30 to 40% more CPU efficient. So you can run about 3 models of A2 full for 2 of A1 standard. A2 light is even lighter than A2 full. It's meant for embedded systems. It scores lower than A2 full, but higher than some of the third-party comparisons. In terms of sound and stats, there are fewer aliasing-like artifacts, less high-frequency ringing in high-gain amps, and basically better high-frequency sound. A2 is not fully backwards compatible. A1 hosts cannot load A2 models, but A2 hosts can load A1 models, and Neural Amp Modeler Core version 0.5.2 or later seems capable of loading the A2 models and A1 models. In terms of the objective tests, I like objective measurements. I started to like them when I learned about acoustic treatment, because you can do a lot just moving your speakers. You don't need to spend money. So objective measurements can be used to sell products, but they can also be used to not buy them if you can understand the measurements and they're fair. So yeah, the measurements can definitely lie. You know, manufacturers are not always honest, but if you think critically, then they can be helpful. The gold standard for objective tests is typically the null test, whereas the null will say how much is left. These are more fancy, the ones that they used. So they used one called ESR, which is the error to signal ratio, that focuses on residual error. It's the closest to the null test, and it's the leftover difference relative to the original. This is the one that I was most familiar with hearing from the modeling people, so pay attention to that. The MAE is mean absolute error. It focuses on sample differences, which is like waveform peeping, kind of like how legacy image models focused on pixel-to-pixel comparison, and new ones are comparing human perception. That's where we get into the log-mel test. The mel bands are like barks, but for pitch perception. So they divide up the frequency spectrum into these mel bands, and the mel bands are for pitch and frequency as opposed to barks, which are perceptual masking. You have what I like to call the Mrs. Tuft, the MRS-TFT test, which is basically tonal versus transient. You guys might be familiar with some of those equalizers, and it's pretty much like using spectrum analyzers with different windows. And then they kind of wrapped all of this up into an ELO, which is a summary score, sort of like in chess where individual games have a score, and then your ELO is your overall ranking, or songs versus album or something like that, because no individual metric is perfect, but if you use several, then you can kind of come to a better picture of what's taking place in an objective way. Let's move on to subjective tests. The final arbiter is the ear. So a lot of people are anti-measurement, but it's really not rational to think that way, because every single thing in audio is built with measurements, whether a company uses the measurements to market or not. So they did a listening test. And many of you may be familiar with an A/B test or an ABX test. That's for detectability. Does X match this hidden or this recording that's playing now? Mushra is more fancy. So Mushra means multiple stimuli with hidden reference and anchors, which is basically, it's not just one thing playing, it's several. I remember taking this was like maybe 7 different things playing back. One of the examples is a reference, so it's the exact same recording, I believe, and then one is a low-pass anchor to kind of pull scores for like a lower reference, pretty much. And then this Mushra test involves a kind of cleanup process where if people can't distinguish these references and the lower anchor reliably, they just throw that data out, because some people just click or whatever. So It's really more of a how close are these compared to the reference, instead of a yes/no for an ABX test. And let's get into the results of these two tests. A2 won everything that they published. There's more to the comparisons, which we'll get into later, but A2 full was a clean sweep. And before we get into the numbers, let's talk about some statistics stuff. I'm not a stats person, so I had to understand this. But for the median scores, you pretty much want to line up everything. So imagine that there was only 100 results. They divide it into the lowest, like the 10th one from the bottom, then the 25th, then the 50th, which is the median, Q3, which is the 75th, and then the 90th, which is P90, which also happens to be a great weapon in CS2, maybe the best one. So Mushra tends to bunch up around 100, at least in this example. So it's good to look at the lower scores. And that also kind of goes into listening test psychology, where inexperienced listeners tend to rate things more highly. So it's valuable to look at the lower end of the data. I'm going to focus on A1 versus A2. I don't really care about the comparisons to the other ones, but with what I'm showing you here, you will at least be able to go to the NAM A2 complete guide and make those comparisons yourself. But the actual results are A1 standard versus A2 full. Objectively, the median, and that's the middle number, ESR, which is the error to signal ratio, is halved. So it went from 0.0062, which is basically 6,000ths of a whatever, to 0.0033. So you could say it's objectively twice as good in terms of ESR. The ELO went from 1834 to 2039. So whatever that means, it's better. In terms of the subjective tests, your P10, which again is if you took 1,000 people took these tests, right? So 1,000 times however many responses. But if you were just to pretend like there was only 100, the 10th lowest from A1 standard to A2 full went from 70.4 to 77.8. So that's the 10th lowest score comparing A1 to A2. It's pretty good. It's like 7.5 points for the worst. And then P25, sorry, it's Q1. Okay, I call it P25, but Q1, it was a smaller jump from 87 to 90. So for those people who ranked it around 25th lowest scores, there was a smaller improvement, but it was one. And then if you average the scores, the reference file actually didn't score 100%, which I thought was interesting. The hidden reference was only scored 97.5. But the mean or the average score from A1 to A2 went from 88.8 to 92.44. So that's almost 3, or about 2.5 or so. Math, help me. Yeah, like 4.5 points percent. If that's not wrong, correct me in the comments. Okay, so that's what the data shows. There's more at the NAM A2 complete guide, which I'll pop up here. It's just really kind of hard to, mouse over everything and show you guys. So just take my word for it. And I'll put the link in the description. What's not covered? Other industry leaders such as Kemper, which is a modeling, probably the granddaddy of guitar modelers, also a leader for a long time. And there was no head-to-head with circuit modeling products such as Fractal. And these are the most pro emulations that I was aware of prior to NAM. Certainly, I know Stephen Carpenter from the Deftones uses Fractal. A lot of people use Kemper. And these weren't included. So I think leaving them out is a noteworthy omission. And this doesn't cover preference versus accuracy. The Mushra test is about how similar, not how much do you prefer. And so you would need a different test. So you can prefer something that's inaccurate. You know, a lot of people prefer vinyl, even though CDs are more accurate. Happens all the time. I mean, technically, a distorted guitar amplifier is not showing you what the guitar actually sounds like, and you want that. And it also doesn't include preferences as it pertains to workflow, ecosystem, or player feel. They make claims that the feel is better or whatever, it's related to different things, but it is not directly reflected in these tests. So in terms of the takeaway, A2 is better than A1 in all of the published objective and subjective tests, including CPU. So that's great. They made an improvement there. Again, I don't really care about the comparisons to these other models, TONEX, Neural DSP. You know, some maybe you do. Maybe you're invested in those ecosystems, or that's your company. I never even heard of Line 6 proxy. So, you know, I do use NAM sometimes. I personally use M Turbo Amp. I'm in the Melda ecosystem, but Melda also has the A1 loader, so that's my skin in the game. But yeah, I really don't care. They threw these in there. That's nice. What I like is that the NAM people were willing to put data where the hype is. A lot of companies don't do that, whether it's speakers or, you know, guitar modelers. So I really do respect that. At least it's something that we can pick through. And they publish the raw data too on GitHub. So if you're really into that kind of thing, you can examine it, which I like because it's in the open source spirit. So even though I cannot really read a bunch of source code that well, I can read maybe some HTML. Presumably other people can. And so I support that as well. None of this inherently makes NAM the best product in the world, but none of it shows that it's the worst either. Yeah, again, take the third-party comparisons with a grain of salt. It will be interesting to see how other companies respond. I kind of doubt that they're going to put out their own data, because usually the people who lead with data put it out, lead with it because it helps them. But, you know, they might say something. We'll see. So enjoy your new NAM. Make sure you update it. I'm going to be waiting until Melda updates their host, which should be soon. So congrats to the NAM team. Thank you very much for putting out the data, and I'll see you in the next video.